Good morning. I know you hear me say this most Sundays, but it truly is good to see everybody here. And from week to week, there's a few that we don't necessarily see here, and so when we do, it's an extra pleasure. And these days that we are living in, you never quite know who you're going to see because you never not quite know who's going to be sick and who's not. But God bless you for making the effort to be here. We're continuing this morning in our series on the book of Matthew. We're in chapter 16. I'll be reading from verses 13 to 28. Matthew 16, verses 13 to 28. Would you please stand for the reading of God's word? When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man come in his kingdom." Thank you, and please be seated. If you were to think back upon the days of all the Star Trek movies, you probably remember this one where it entertains the notion of a new scientific accomplishment that they are ready to deploy. It's called the Genesis Project. And they shoot out this capsule from the starship, and it goes down to this dead planet. And by the time the capsule has finished working its magic, this planet has been renewed in every way, teeming with life and beautiful to behold. Of course, in the movie, it didn't work out so well. The bad guys got a hold of it, and it was ultimately unstable and a tremendous failure. But we're talking about a different kind of Genesis project where it's not going to be a failure, it's going to be a success. God is working his magic even as we speak. It was his plan from the beginning of time. He saw, in a spiritual sense, a planet load of people who were dead in their sins and needed to be redeemed. The planet needed to have life brought to it. Well, as you come to this episode of Jesus here in Caesarea Philippi, you kind of wonder what might not be said. We would like to know more about the passage than shows up. Was there something else that Jesus did in Caesarea Philippi because there is this very brief conversation, and then they're not there anymore. And it's kind of like what we talked about last week, this trip up to the region of Tyre and Sidon. They go into this house. They don't want anybody to know it, according to the Gospel of Mark. And pretty much very soon after they arrive, here's a woman who's asking for a miracle of cleansing her daughter from evil spirit. And Jesus seems reluctant. Well, we talked about that. And suffice it to say, the woman left very satisfied with the results of her encounter with Jesus. But you wonder what more was going on, because it doesn't say the purpose of the trip, unless the purpose was this encounter, which seems kind of illogical if he didn't want anybody to know when he went into the house after he arrived. And we get to this place of Caesarea Philippi, and there is a question he asked his apostles. And after careful thought, I believe it's a lot clearer that this whole reason for the trip is because of this conversation. This conversation will be pivotal to the future evangelistic endeavors of those apostles who were there. Well, where is Caesarea Philippi? Well, you'll recall in the Old Testament days it talked about the extent of the land from north to south being from Dan to Beersheba. Dan was near the pre-existing city of Laish, which was far enough away from Tyre and Sidon that nobody could come help them in battle. When the tribe of Dan was looking for a new place to settle, they had been further south, and there wasn't enough land for them, and so they went north and they established themselves around this city called Dan. And it is about 3.5 miles from Dan to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was a city established by Alexander the Great. It was not a place that many Jews ever went. Now it points out that Jesus and his disciples went to the region of Caesarea Philippi, but it doesn't say they went into the town of Caesarea Philippi any more than it says he went into the town of Tyre or Sidon, as we looked at it last week. Well, at this location, you find a very famous land formation that's been there for a long time. And if you're here and you've been coming on Wednesday nights to the men's Bible study, you'll know part of what my sermon is about, because it's already been said. He said, well, this part I can sleep through. Well, don't sleep too long. You might miss something. But we did talk about the fact of a thing called the gates of Hades, being a specific location just outside of the town of Caesarea Philippi, which was at the foot of Mount Hermon, that highest mountain, over 10,000 feet high, around 10,000, higher than any other mountain in the area. Well, here at the foot of this mountain is this hole where there's water, and how far in it goes, I'm not sure anybody necessarily ever talked about, because I couldn't find much about that. But here Jesus stands at what is referred to as the gates of Hades, and he makes this statement to Peter about the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And so at this gate of Hades, there's this cave. You might call it a grotto. I'm not sure what you would most accurately call it, but it was the place in antiquity that was thought to be the access of the god Pan to the underworld, the place of the dead. And every springtime, this god Pan comes out of that gates of Hades and makes his presence known by his activities that are supposedly resulting in the rain that falls and the crops that grow and so forth. But you have a God who is thought of as half man and half goat. And I thought to myself as I read about that, well, that sounds like another creature that I remember reading about, and I went and looked that up. No, that was half man and half, a bull head. Anyway, half man and half goat. And this man is thought of, this half man, half goat creature is thought of as the god of fertility, who engages in the acts of fertility with other gods of the region, and somehow that influences the rain and so forth and so on. And so there's this access to the underworld. Pan comes in the spring, brings the rain and all of this. And occasionally, I don't know exactly how often, there was a gathering of goats with people, dancing with goats, music, a heightened sensory climax that might be referred to as pandemonium, the release of Pan from the Hadean world, sexual deviancy that takes place at this gathering at multiple levels of sexual deviancy, and the powers of evil spirits. Why on earth would any self-respecting Jew ever go here? But that is where Jesus brought his apostles, and he asks this question. I have referred to this Roman numeral 2 in my outline as the Great Confession. That's not the Great Commission, but the Great Confession, and that is Peter's statement to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Amen. That declaration was one I believe Jesus wanted made in the presence of his apostles at this location, in a sense of firm victory over the powers of darkness. This is not an incidental declaration. It was not something that Jesus had not anticipated Peter making. It was focal to their presence there. Jesus is the Christ, that is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. There were lots of gods, but there was only one living God. And this living God trumps the dead gods every time. Well, the outworking of this truth toward the renewal of the earth is something that Jesus points to as he thinks of the function of Peter. He says, "And I say to you, you are Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church." Now you may have heard that Peter is Petros and the rock that he builds his church on is Petra, and they're not the same. And that's very true. Any Greek text will tell you that's exactly what's going on. I believe there is a word play, and the name Peter, which Jesus had given to Simon the apostle earlier on, was one that would come into play at this point. The name Peter being associated with a rock of greater truth than Peter could ever imagine or think. "Upon this rock I will build my church." Not so much speaking of the great things that Peter would do, but I do believe Jesus is addressing Peter with a truth about Peter. And that is to say that even as there is this reality of the forces of evil that are being presented here, and the forces of evil that come out in the form of idolatry and idol worship all across the ancient world. You remember Paul and Barnabas were in one town, and they thought Paul and Barnabas were gods, and they started to sacrifice to them and so forth. And with all the words that he could muster, he could scarcely prevent them from making sacrifice. And pretty soon they're stoning him instead. Well, it's one or the other, isn't it? Well, you know, there's going to be days of disappointment. There's going to be days of a great challenge. I wonder what kinds of temptations and trials maybe Thomas had over in East India and Iraq and Iran. I wonder what kinds of trials Peter had as he moved on from Palestine over into first Asia Minor and then over into Rome and that area. I wonder what kinds of things Jesus knew they would need to be ready for. And I certainly understand the great disappointment that Peter had while Jesus was still alive was the fact that he denied that he even knew him. Jesus knew that that would happen. He said to him before it happens, and when this is over, and he points toward the future. And before he ascended into heaven, there's this conversation along the shore of the Sea of Galilee where Jesus asked him, "Do you love me?" And he says, "Yes," and he asks him 3 times to get Peter to very strongly associate that reality with the reality of this mission of changing this dead world into a living world.
Amen.
And if the influence of your life has been to see people grow and to see truths that they have not seen and to become people that were more outstanding and more principled and greater integrity and so forth, then you've seen this power go forth. We sang the song, "Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer. This is my constant longing and prayer." And this is what Jesus was pushing toward with those apostles and toward Peter in this declaration. Peter says, you've got a future. You're going to be that first one. The church will be founded upon your earliest teaching that shows up as we read in Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 3, Acts chapter 5, Acts chapter 7. You see, it was Peter was that first spokesman. I believe that's why Jesus said, "And I give you the keys to the kingdom."
Amen.
And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And so there is a thing happening. First of all, I want to correct kind of a misunderstanding, and that is with regard to the gates of Hades. It says in John chapter 1 verse 5, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." In that sense, you see how it is the light that is advancing, and darkness is just absence of light. There's no way that darkness can ever overcome light. Do you see that? And in this passage, Jesus says, "And the gates of Hades shall never prevail against it." The prevailing is done by the church. It is the church that is moving forward, that is taking new territory because there are disciples of the Lord present. And so you see, he says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Some said, "Oh, well, that's a reference to Peter being the first pope."
No.
Well, I don't think so.
No.
And here's why. I think sometimes we have missed a vital passage in this regard that shows up in John chapter 20, verses 21 to 23. In the Gospel of John, then, we read these words. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." Okay, now we've got the idea of a mission. We've got the idea of a commission, as they are the ones to fulfill the mission. And it goes on to say, "And with that he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Well, you know what? That sounds a lot like what he said to Peter in Matthew 16. "Anything you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Anything you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." But you see then, not only is this a very strong parallel where it seems to be very clear all 12 apostles are receiving this extra filling of the Holy Spirit at this moment. Note that Peter was present. It wasn't Peter there and the other 11 here. Something happened earlier on where Jesus is encouraging Peter, and then later on where Jesus is encouraging all 12 toward the fulfillment of that mission of life that we saw by seeing a dead planet versus a live planet. okay, let me back up and show you. I've got a great big disjunction. Peter was given to the keys of the kingdom, but now I'm just looking to show you the reality of what the Bible teaches about the role of Peter versus the role of the other apostles. First of all, you see in Galatians chapter 2 that Paul rebuked Peter in Galatia in front of other people. This was not a private conversation, but Paul is emphatic to point out to the Galatians that this happened as a point of reminder, because what Peter was doing was hypocritical in going and eating with the Gentile Christians when the Jewish Christians hadn't arrived yet, the circumcised Christians hadn't arrived yet, but when they do arrive and insist that everybody has to follow the law of Moses in order to be saved, all of a sudden Peter pulls back. And he's not going to supper anymore with the Gentile Christians. And Paul rebukes him to his face because there was a very strong sense of the growing nature of that light overcoming the darkness that's supposed to happen in Galatia. And if Peter pulls back and that is seen as God's will, then we've got a big problem. But Paul rebukes Peter. That doesn't sound like somebody who's Pope getting rebuked by somebody who's not Pope. Second, James, the brother of Jesus, was the moderator at the Jerusalem conference. James, the brother of Jesus, not Peter. That doesn't sound like a Pope. Number 3, Peter was to the Jewish world what Paul was to the Gentile world. Neither was greater than the other. So you see in the book of Acts, Peter healed the lame, Acts chapter 3, verse 6, chapter 9, verse 33. Peter raised the dead, Acts 9, verse 40. Peter cast out demons, Acts chapter 5, verse 16. He healed the sick when the shadow fell across other people, Acts chapter 5 and verse 15. In like manner, Paul also healed the lame in Acts 14:10. Paul also raised the dead in Acts 20, verse 10. Paul also cast out demons in Acts chapter 16, verse 18. And he healed the sick in Acts chapter 14, verse 9 and 28 and verse 8. And so you see this parallel role of ministry, one to the Jews, the other to the Gentiles. Fourth, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, it suggests that the church is built on the foundation of all the apostles and the prophets together. Not just one apostle or a few apostles, but all the apostles. That argues a unity of purpose where one does not stand out above another. Number 5, if the amount of New Testament scripture were being viewed as an indication of the esteem of one apostle over the others, certainly Paul would be looked upon as the greatest apostle of the New Testament and not Peter. Paul was absolutely more trained in the Old Testament prior to becoming an apostle compared to the sparse preparation Peter would have had as a fisherman. Sixth, the idea of Peter having been given the keys to the kingdom makes sense from the standpoint of Peter occupying a leading role as the prominent speaker in the early chapters of the book of Acts, where the beginnings of the early church are documented. Number 7, the whole idea of the church having a supreme apostolic leader is founded on tying the model of government of the church after the government of the Roman Empire, where the emperor was that supreme leader. But this idea never showed up in the church until the 3rd century, when there was a controversy about when to celebrate Easter, and the bishop of one major area is excommunicating bishops of other major areas in a power grab, and that's where that whole idea of a pope began to develop. No, Peter was not the first pope. But moving on from that point, you see, that's not a thing that Jesus was talking about at all. It wasn't in the mind of the people. So let's get back to what Jesus was talking about, where he points out that he's the Messiah. This great conviction, the central point of what Jesus is saying is that he is the Messiah, The mission of the Messiah is to build the church. I will build my church. That was the point. If you want to know what the subject was, that was the subject. Not the role of Peter in it, but the subject was Christ building his church. How? With the help of the apostles, which he was in the business of training. And that advancement of the church will not be overcome by the dark forces of idolatry represented by the activities of the gates of Hades in Caesarea Philippi. And so the activity of Peter, with all the other apostles, will also serve the mission of the establishment of the church as God's design for the renewal and redemption of the world. The apostles will have a job after Jesus is gone. That's why Jesus is here, and that's why this conversation is taking place. Aside from this great conviction, there is a great association that is now made between Jesus' messiahship and suffering. The central point of the discussion was Jesus as a Messiah. The next main point, as you read the text, was that the Christ must suffer. When they understood clearly that Jesus was the Messiah, then Jesus began to tell them he must go to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the religious leaders will crucify him. In chapter 16, verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer. Chapter 16, verse 24, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And aside from that great association of messiahship and suffering, don't turn loose of that song, "Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer." You might want to sing that song a little lower, a little softer, till you make up in your mind whether you're ready for the suffering, because it's associated. There is also a great reward. Then he will reward each person according, it says, to what he has done. The reward is not only given according to what is done, but it's given in relation to the manner of Jesus' return. How did Jesus return? In his Father's glory. Wow! Can you imagine witnessing the Jesus return in the glory of the Father? That will be a day to behold as no other day since the world was founded. In the Father's glory is the manner of Jesus' return, and that reward will be given in that manner. Second, it will be given with his angels. Jesus returns in his Father's glory with his angels. It's not like it's just a few people here. This is a big crowd of angels too. And we like angels. Well, it goes on to say that it would be, the reward would be presented at that time. There is a great reward. It is certain. And as you begin then to realize the impact of the discussion that takes place at the gates of Hades, just outside of Caesarea Philippi, what you begin to understand, the trip, the discussion, was about the mission to renew and redeem the world in righteousness. It was about the reward that would come because of participating with Jesus in that mission. And third, it was about forces of darkness that would not prevail, but rather victory in Jesus would prevail. That's a victory that you can know today, in your relationships today, in your associations today, in what you take in versus what you don't take in today. The victory starts here as righteousness grows now and prepares us for that life which is eternal. If you would like to be a part of that and you're not sure if you are, today is the day to get it straight. Will you come as we stand and sing?